The clearing smelled of crushed pine, damp earth, and the sharp, metallic tang of violence. 7 of the Royal Guard, elite trackers who had never lost a target, lay motionless among the shattered oak branches and muddy ravines. In the center of the devastation knelt Lisa. Her breath hitched, her chest heaving under a torn canvas jacket, her bruised hands empty but still curled into tight, defensive fists. She did not look away when the tree line broke and David stepped into the clearing. His tailored overcoat was immaculate, a stark, jarring contrast to the mud and ruin at his feet. The surviving guards drew their weapons, their hands shaking with fury and unspoken terror. David raised a single, gloved hand. Silence slammed over the forest. He stared down at the bruised, defiant woman who had decimated his finest men. "Clean her. Bring her to my palace," the Alpha King ordered. The heavy steel doors of the armored SUV slammed shut, sealing Lisa inside a suffocating, soundproof quiet. The engine purred to life, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the reinforced floorboards and seeped into her aching bones. She remained exactly where the guards had shoved her, on the grated floor paneling, her knees bruised and pressed tightly together, her back rigid against the door. Outside, the rain had begun to fall again, drumming a relentless, muted rhythm against the tinted, bulletproof glass. The storm was washing away the evidence of the gorge, but it could not wash away the adrenaline still surging through her veins. Across the spacious, dimly lit cabin, seated in a high-backed leather chair that looked entirely out of place in a tactical transport vehicle, sat David. He did not look like a man who had just lost half of his elite hunting echelon. His posture was casually relaxed, one long leg crossed over the other, his dark, amber-flecked eyes fixed entirely upon her. He offered no immediate threats. He demanded no frantic answers. The silence he projected was intentional, a heavy, suffocating blanket that was far more terrifying than any verbal interrogation. Lisa kept her chin lowered, allowing the wet, tangled curtain of her dark hair to shield her expression. Her mind raced, violently cataloging the phantom pains shooting up her left arm and the steady, warm sting of a shallow branch cut near her collarbone. How had the situation deteriorated so rapidly? She had rigged the northern ravine perfectly. The non-lethal snare lines, the rockfall diversions, the acoustic tripwires. They were meticulously designed to trap, confuse, and delay. They were meant to send a warning, not deliver a death sentence. But the hunters had been far too aggressive, completely blinded by the intoxicating thrill of the chase. They had recklessly driven their own heavy pursuit vehicles directly into the unstable gorge, ignoring the warning signs she had left, triggering a catastrophic terrain collapse. She had not struck them down with her own hands, but their broken bodies lay in the mud because of her engineering. In the eyes of this hidden, ruthless society, she was a mass murderer. In the eyes of the Alpha King sitting motionless across from her, she was a terrifying anomaly. "You are calculating the distance to the door lock and the kinetic force required to shatter it," David said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone that betrayed absolutely no anger, only a polite, detached curiosity. It was the careful tone of a seasoned scholar observing a highly dangerous, newly captured specimen. Lisa stiffened, her breath catching briefly in her throat. She slowly raised her head, parting the wet strands of hair with a trembling hand to meet his unwavering gaze. His eyes caught the faint overhead cabin light, glowing with an unnatural intensity. "The electronic lock engages securely at 15 miles per hour," she replied, her voice raspy from the biting cold and the severe adrenaline crash. We are currently traveling at approximately 45. Even if I successfully bypass the locking mechanism, the kinetic impact of my body on the wet asphalt would shatter my femur and likely collapse my left lung. I am not calculating a futile escape. I am calculating my immediate survival. A faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in David's expression. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but a genuine acknowledgement of her logic. "A deeply pragmatic assessment," he murmured, calmly adjusting the pristine cuffs of his shirt. My men lacked such necessary pragmatism. They relied entirely on their superior physical strength and the overwhelming arrogance of their numbers. They assumed a solitary wanderer would panic and run blindly into the open. You did not panic, Lisa. You built a slaughterhouse. Hearing her own name fall from his lips sent a profound, icy chill cascading down her spine. He knew exactly who she was. This was not a random territorial apprehension. The fragmented, deeply buried memories of the roaring fire that had destroyed her family's hidden sanctuary 3 years ago flared violently in her mind. The choking smoke, the shattering glass, the desperate, bloody command from her father to run into the dark and never look back. She had remained perfectly hidden for so long, a ghost in the borderlands. "I am not a rogue, and I am not an assassin," she said softly, the polite but unyielding defiance in her tone mirroring his rigid civility. "I was simply walking through the northern quadrant. I was gathering winter supplies. Your men initiated the unprovoked aggression. They hunted me for sport." David leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. The physical distance between them vanished conceptually, the air in the cabin growing overwhelmingly thick and electrically charged. "The northern quadrant is my sovereign, protected territory. And those men..." He paused, his amber eyes hardening just enough to reveal the ruthless apex predator lurking just beneath the tailored wool coat, "were operating under my crest. We will very soon determine if you are a tragic victim of circumstance, a terrified survivor, or something far more dangerous to my reign." The heavy SUV turned sharply, the massive tires hissing loudly on the wet pavement as the towering, iron-wrought gates of his private estate loomed ominously through the windshield. The tactical vehicle glided to a smooth halt, the engine cutting off to leave a ringing silence in its wake. Through the rain-streaked glass, Lisa observed the imposing silhouette of David's estate. It was not a traditional, archaic castle, but rather a sprawling, brutalist masterpiece of dark concrete, reinforced steel, and expansive tinted glass, severely nestled against the jagged cliffside. It radiated immense power and impenetrable security. The heavy doors were pulled open from the outside by 2 silent guards, the crisp night air rushing into the cabin. David stepped out first, his movements fluid and unhurried. He did not look back at Lisa as the guards hauled her roughly by her uninjured arm, dragging her out into the stinging rain. She stumbled, her exhausted legs nearly giving way. But she forced herself to stand upright, refusing to show further weakness. Standing beneath the vast, illuminated portico was a tall, severe-looking woman dressed in a meticulously pressed charcoal uniform. Her graying hair was pulled back into an uncompromising bun, and her hands were clasped respectfully in front of her. "Mrs. Gable," David addressed the woman, his tone shifting to one of authoritative administration. "Our guest has had a remarkably taxing evening in the northern woods. Follow my earlier instructions. I want her thoroughly attended to, medically assessed, and brought to my private study within the hour." "At once, sir," Mrs. Gable replied, her sharp eyes flicking briefly over Lisa's mud-caked, shivering form. She displayed no disgust, only a cold, professional efficiency. David turned on his heel and disappeared through the massive glass double doors, leaving Lisa stranded in the custody of the estate staff. "Come with me, cleanly," Mrs. Gable instructed, her voice lacking warmth but carrying a distinct lack of malice. She gestured toward a secondary entrance. "Do not attempt to track more mud than is absolutely necessary, and do not entertain the foolish notion of running. The perimeter is fully automated and entirely lethal." Lisa followed silently, her heavy, waterlogged boots squelching awkwardly against the pristine, heated granite floors of the sprawling corridors. The transition from the wild, chaotic violence of the forest to this sterile, terrifyingly quiet environment was deeply disorienting. Every hallway they passed was heavily monitored, the subtle whir of security cameras tracking their every step. She was no longer a hunted animal in the woods. She was a prized captive in a gilded, unbreakable cage. Mrs. Gable led her into a vast, luxuriously appointed bathing chamber constructed entirely of dark slate and brushed copper. The centerpiece was a sunken, circular tub already filling with steaming, aromatic water. Two younger staff members stood by silently, holding thick white towels and a simple folded garment. "Remove your outerwear," Mrs. Gable commanded gently but firmly. Lisa hesitated, her hands instinctively crossing over her chest to protect the torn canvas jacket. It was filthy, ruined, and soaked in cold mud. But it was her armor. It held her hidden pockets, her lockpicks, her small survival blade stitched into the lining. Removing it meant surrendering the last remnants of her autonomy. "If you do not remove it voluntarily, I will have the guards forcefully cut it from your body," Mrs. Gable stated, her tone entirely conversational. "You have survived an encounter that no one else has. Do not waste your life on the indignity of stubbornness. The king expects you clean." Swallowing the bitter taste of defeat, Lisa slowly unbuttoned the jacket, letting it drop to the slate floor with a heavy, wet thud. She stripped off her ruined boots and her damp layers, standing vulnerable and shivering in the warm, humid air of the chamber. The younger attendants approached, their eyes respectfully averted as they gently guided her down the shallow copper steps into the scalding water. The heat was agonizingly brilliant. It bit savagely into the cuts on her collarbone and the deep, dark bruises mottling her ribs. The attendants moved with clinical precision, using soft sponges and fragrant soaps to scrub away the layers of dried mud, pine needles, and the faint, lingering traces of blood that did not belong to her. Lisa sat perfectly still, her eyes tracking the exits, counting the seconds, analyzing the structural weak points of the heavy oak door. She forced her breathing to remain slow and even, masking the deep, pulsing terror that threatened to consume her. They washed her tangled hair, rinsing away the scent of ozone and wet earth, replacing it with the subtle, expensive aroma of bergamot and cedar. When the physical cleansing was complete, she was guided out of the water and dried meticulously. A medic entered briefly, applying a stinging antiseptic and clear bandages to her deeper lacerations without speaking a single word. Finally, Mrs. Gable handed her the folded garment. It was a long, sweeping dress made of heavy, dark emerald silk. It was incredibly soft, beautiful, and completely restrictive. It lacked pockets. The fabric pooled around her ankles, ensuring she could not run without tripping. It was a brilliant, subtle method of absolute control. "You look presentable," Mrs. Gable noted, adjusting the collar of the silk dress to appropriately cover the bandages. "He does not usually bring the survivors inside the main house. Keep your voice low, speak only when addressed, and remember your place." Lisa met the older woman's stern gaze, her own eyes reflecting a hardened, unbreakable resolve. I am perfectly aware of my place, Mrs. Gable. I am the survivor. The journey through the quiet, cavernous halls of the estate felt like walking the final miles to an execution chamber. The soft rustle of Lisa's emerald silk dress against the polished floorboards was the only sound permitted in the heavy silence. Mrs. Gable walked 2 precise paces ahead, guiding her away from the brightly lit, modern public spaces and deeper into the older, more secluded wing of the brutalist mansion. The air here was noticeably different. Cooler, thicker, laced with the distinct, masculine scent of aged paper, burning wood smoke, and the lingering, electric aroma of cedar that she now explicitly associated with David. They stopped before a set of towering, intricately carved oak doors. Mrs. Gable knocked twice, a sharp, rhythmic sound, before turning the heavy brass handle and pushing the door open. She gestured for Lisa to enter, instantly retreating and pulling the heavy door shut behind her with a definitive, final click. Lisa stood frozen just inside the threshold, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim, amber lighting of the expansive study. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, packed tight with ancient, leather-bound volumes and modern, sleek technology. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, a modest fire crackling quietly within its soot-stained hearth. Rain lashed fiercely against the expansive, reinforced glass windows overlooking the dark, churning ocean far below the cliffside. David stood by the window, his back to her, watching the violent storm rage outside. He had changed from his mud-spattered tactical coat into a dark, flawlessly tailored charcoal suit. He looked incredibly imposing, a silhouette of raw, restrained power against the lightning-streaked sky. "Please, have a seat, Lisa," he said, his voice easily carrying over the sound of the rain. He did not turn around immediately. Lisa cautiously moved toward the center of the room, her bare feet silent on the thick Persian rug. 2 plush leather armchairs sat facing each other in front of the roaring fire, separated by a low mahogany table. On the table rested a delicate, steaming silver tea service. The profound juxtaposition of elegant, refined hospitality, stacked against the brutal, lethal circumstances of her capture, made her stomach twist violently. She chose the chair facing the door. Sitting gracefully, but keeping her posture rigidly upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap, David finally turned, his amber eyes locking onto her immediately. He walked slowly across the room, his gaze sweeping over her newly cleaned, carefully dressed form. He noted the hidden tension in her shoulders, the way she tracked his every subtle movement. He took the seat opposite her, leaning forward to elegantly pour 2 cups of dark, fragrant tea. "Sugar, or do you prefer it bitter?" he asked politely, holding the delicate silver tongs over a porcelain bowl. Why am I drinking tea with the man who should currently be ordering my execution?" Lisa asked, completely ignoring his polite inquiry. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the absolute terror that gripped her chest. "I decimated your elite echelon. I humiliated your finest trackers. By the ancient laws of your society, my life is entirely forfeit to your vengeance." David paused, placing the silver tongs back onto the tray with a soft, metallic clink. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his long fingers together, his expression unreadable. "You are heavily burdened by the assumption that I am grieving the loss of those men," he replied smoothly. "You assume that I sent them into the northern woods with the explicit directive to hunt you down and kill you." Lisa frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through her carefully constructed facade. "They bore your crest. They drove your vehicles. They declared, very loudly, that they were operating under the direct authority of the Alpha King. If they were not acting on your orders, then whose orders were they following? Their own, David said, his voice dropping an octave, the temperature in the room seemingly plunging alongside it. The men you so efficiently dismantled in the gorge were not conducting a sanctioned border patrol. They were rogue operators operating within my own ranks. They have been secretly taking heavy bribes from a rival syndicate to quietly eliminate undocumented survivors traversing my territory. They were acting as violent, unsanctioned mercenaries, dragging my crest through the mud. Lisa stared at him, her mind spinning rapidly as the implications of his words settled into her exhausted brain. She had not killed his loyal soldiers. She had unknowingly exterminated a group of deeply entrenched traitors. You knew, she whispered, her eyes widening slightly as the horrific realization dawned on her. You knew exactly what they were doing in the woods. You knew they were hunting innocent people. But as the king, you could not publicly execute your own elite guard without concrete, undeniable proof of their treason. It would have caused a massive political uprising within your court. David took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea, his amber eyes completely devoid of warmth. And then, a brilliant, desperate ghost wandering the borderlands did the extremely difficult work for me. You engineered a flawless, tragic accident in the gorge. You eliminated my political problem without leaving a single trace of royal involvement. Lisa's hands began to shake slightly, not from the cold, but from the sudden, terrifying realization of the dangerous political game she had inadvertently stepped into. If I did you a favor, she stated, her voice tight, then why am I a prisoner in your palace? Because... David leaned forward, his presence overwhelming the space between them. While I am privately grateful for your lethal efficiency, the public reality remains. You are an undocumented outsider who slaughtered 7 of my decorated guards. To maintain absolute order, I cannot simply let you walk away. The society demands a severe consequence. The society demands your head. He placed his empty teacup gently onto the silver tray, the soft sound echoing loudly in the tense silence of the study. I have exactly 48 hours to decide how to legally dismantle you, Lisa. Convince me why I shouldn't. Morning arrived at the estate, not with the gentle, warming rays of a rising sun, but with a pale, bruised light that struggled uselessly against the heavy coastal fog. Lisa stood by the expansive, reinforced glass window of her assigned quarters, her posture rigidly upright. She had not slept. Her mind had spent the long, agonizing hours of the night, running through 1,000 horrific scenarios, calculating the exact probability of her execution against the strange, temporary reprieve David had offered. The room behind her was a masterpiece of cold, modern luxury. A massive bed adorned with charcoal linens, minimalist oak furniture, and a complete absence of anything that could be weaponized. Even the heavy glass lamps were securely bolted to the mahogany nightstands. She was a guest in title, but a high-risk prisoner in reality. The heavy, biometric lock on the oak door clicked softly, a distinct sound that sent an immediate spike of adrenaline surging through her veins. Mrs. Gable entered with her characteristic silence, pushing a sleek, silver cart adorned with covered porcelain dishes and a freshly pressed set of garments. "Good morning, Lisa," Mrs. Gable said, her tone devoid of any genuine warmth, functioning entirely on practiced, rigid courtesy. "The Alpha King requests your presence in the solarium for breakfast. You are to dress appropriately for a meeting with his inner council." Lisa turned away from the fog-drenched window, her eyes narrowing slightly at the neatly folded fabrics resting on the bottom shelf of the cart. "I am essentially a dead woman walking, Mrs. Gable. What possible purpose could my attendance at a council meeting serve? It is not my place to question the architectural strategies of his reign, nor is it yours, Mrs. Gable replied smoothly, pouring a single cup of dark, rich coffee and placing it on the small side table. Your purpose is to survive until he decides otherwise. I suggest you wear the tailored slacks and the high-collared silk blouse. They project a necessary aura of intellectual authority rather than subservience. 30 minutes later, dressed in the immaculate, restrictive garments, Lisa was escorted through the winding, silent corridors of the brutalist mansion. The solarium was a breathtaking glass enclave, suspended precariously over the jagged, crashing waves of the Pacific. David was already seated at the head of a long, polished obsidian table. 3 other men, heavily scarred and radiating an oppressive, lethal aura, occupied the adjacent seats. They ceased their low, intense murmuring the moment Lisa crossed the threshold. Their eyes, sharp and thoroughly predatory, tracked her every subtle movement. "Gentlemen," David said softly, not rising from his chair, his amber eyes locking onto Lisa with a piercing, analytical intensity. "Allow me to introduce our newly acquired consultant. She possesses a uniquely intimate, unparalleled knowledge of the northern borderlands." A man with a viciously jagged scar cutting across his left cheek scoffed quietly, leaning back in his heavy leather chair. "A consultant? With all due respect, sire. This is the undocumented vagrant who murdered our men in the gorge. The families of the deceased are demanding her immediate public execution. Bringing her to the inner sanctum is a severe violation of protocol. The men who died in the gorge were actively betraying this pack," David replied, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, melodic baritone that instantly froze the air in the sunlit room. "They were accepting vast sums of illicit currency from the Vanguard Syndicate to allow hostile mercenaries into my sovereign territory. Our guest merely expedited their necessary removal, and she did so with a tactical brilliance that your own deeply funded security divisions failed to detect." The absolute silence that followed was suffocating. The scarred man swallowed hard, the sudden realization of his own dangerous misstep draining the color from his weathered face. Lisa remained perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, carefully maintaining a mask of profound, unreadable detachment. David was brilliantly using her to publicly expose the corruption within his own ranks, shielding himself behind her lethal actions. "Sit, Lisa," David commanded softly, gesturing gracefully to the empty chair directly to his right. It was a position of immense, terrifying honor. It was a visible declaration to the remaining loyalists that she was under his absolute, unquestionable protection. She moved with slow, deliberate precision, pulling out the heavy chair and taking her seat beside the Alpha King. The scent of cedar and ozone radiated from him, a grounding, powerful anchor in the center of the chaotic storm. "If I am to function as your consultant," Lisa said, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror gripping her chest, "I require complete access to your territorial topographical maps, specifically the southern ridge. The traders in the gorge were merely a diversion. The actual incursion is happening elsewhere." The atmosphere in the subterranean strategy room was heavily laden with the scent of aged parchment, burning electronics, and the sharp, metallic tang of focused anxiety. The vast, circular chamber was dominated by a state-of-the-art holographic projection table, currently displaying a glowing, 3-dimensional topographical map of David's expansive coastal territory. Lisa stood at the edge of the softly humming console, the pale blue light casting long, dramatic shadows across her sharp cheekbones. She had spent the last 4 hours meticulously dissecting the patrol routes, her brilliant, analytical mind seeking the hidden patterns in the Vanguard Syndicate's movements. David stood exactly 2 feet away from her, his posture rigidly attentive. He had dismissed his generals hours ago, recognizing that their traditional, aggressive military strategies were entirely useless against an enemy that utilized the same stealth and evasion tactics that Lisa had mastered in the wild. Your perimeter defenses are heavily concentrated on the main highway arteries and the deep northern ravines, Lisa murmured, her slender fingers moving rapidly across the glowing holographic interface. She dragged a series of red markers toward a seemingly innocuous stretch of jagged coastline. It is a logical, mathematically sound deployment. It is exactly what a seasoned military commander would do. And that is precisely why it is going to catastrophically fail. David leaned forward, bracing his strong hands against the polished metallic edge of the console. The physical proximity was overwhelming. Lisa could feel the subtle, radiating heat of his body and hear the slow, measured cadence of his breathing. "Explain your reasoning," he demanded quietly, his amber eyes tracking the swift, deliberate movements of her hands rather than the glowing map itself. "The Vanguard mercenaries are not attempting a massive, brute force invasion," she explained, pulling up a highly detailed, magnified structural overlay of the old smuggling caves honeycombing the southern cliffs. "They are executing a slow, systematic infiltration. Look at the tidal patterns I have highlighted. During the lunar eclipse tomorrow night, the water level within these specific caverns will drop dramatically, exposing a network of dry, ancient tunnels that lead directly into the foundational sublevels of this estate." David's expression remained perfectly composed, a masterclass in stoic, terrifying restraint. But the sudden, sharp tightening of his jaw betrayed the immense gravity of her discovery. The internal threat was far worse than he had initially calculated. "My security chief personally inspected those caverns less than 3 weeks ago," David stated, his voice dangerously soft, practically vibrating with suppressed, lethal fury. He reported that the structural integrity had collapsed, rendering them completely impassable to any organized unit. Lisa finally looked up, meeting his intense gaze with a solemn, uncompromising stillness. "Then your security chief is either tragically incompetent or he is the central architect of this betrayal. A structural collapse of that magnitude leaves distinct sedimentary signatures in the surrounding tidal pools. I analyzed the drone footage from your archives. Those rocks were intentionally detonated to create a false blockage, hiding the deeper tunnel entrances from casual visual inspection. A heavy, profound silence settled over the dimly lit strategy room. David slowly stood up to his full, towering height. He reached out, his gloved fingers lightly brushing against the sleeve of her silk blouse. It was an incredibly brief, electrifying point of contact that sent a sudden jolt of startling warmth straight to her racing heart. It was not a gesture of intimidation. It was a silent, monumental acknowledgement of her invaluable worth. "You have lived your entire life as a hunted ghost in the shadows," David murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to the pale, healing scars barely visible at her collarbone. "You survive because you see the subtle, dangerous fractures in the world that everyone else ignores. I see the fractures because I have repeatedly fallen through them," Lisa replied softly, her voice carrying the heavy, agonizing weight of her past. "I am not attempting to save your kingdom out of a sense of misplaced loyalty. I am ensuring that the men who hunt innocent people do not claim another victory. Your motivations are irrelevant to the current mathematics of our survival," David said, turning decisively toward the heavy steel doors of the vault. "We have less than 24 hours to prepare a counter-ambush. We will allow the Vanguard assassins to breach the southern tunnels. We will let them believe their infiltration is entirely successful. And then, we will bury them beneath the ocean. The grand ballroom of the estate was a dazzling, suffocating display of opulent wealth and thinly veiled, predatory politics. High society members of the pack, wealthy financiers, territorial barons, and dangerous enforcers mingled beneath towering crystal chandeliers, holding delicate flutes of expensive champagne. A string quartet played a melancholic, sweeping sonata in the corner, the beautiful music doing absolutely nothing to mask the underlying electric tension in the room. Tonight was the lunar eclipse. Beneath their very feet, the counter-ambush was already silently unfolding in the flooded caverns. Lisa stood near a massive, intricately carved marble pillar, remaining perfectly still in a stunning midnight blue evening gown that Mrs. Gable had severely insisted upon. The dress was elegant, sweeping the floor with heavy velvet, but it felt like suffocating armor. She hated the exposure. She hated the hundreds of calculating eyes that repeatedly darted in her direction. She was officially attending as David's honored companion, a strategic, highly visible move designed to project absolute confidence while the true battle raged in the dark below. David was navigating the treacherous political waters across the room, seamlessly engaging in polite, venomous conversations with regional leaders. He looked magnificent in a tailored black tuxedo, radiating an aura of untouchable, terrifying authority. Yet, despite the distance and the dense crowd between them, Lisa could feel his awareness constantly tethered to her. Every few minutes, his amber eyes would flick briefly in her direction, verifying her location, silently confirming her safety. Her hyper-vigilant mind continuously scanned the room, cataloging the subtle micro-expressions of the guests. She noted the nervous twitch in a baron's hands, the forced, brittle laughter of a senator's wife, the precise, rigid posture of the armed perimeter guards. Everything appeared normal. Everything appeared perfectly managed. Until the subtle, rhythmic pattern of the room broke. A waiter, dressed in the standard crisp white jacket and black trousers of the estate staff, moved through the crowded floor carrying a silver tray of fresh beverages. His trajectory was smooth, practiced, and entirely unremarkable to the casual observer. But Lisa's sharp eyes instantly locked onto him. It was his footwork. It was too precise, too completely silent on the marble floor. He was not walking like a man, balancing delicate crystal. He was gliding with a deeply ingrained, muscular control of a trained assassin closing in on a target. The waiter was moving directly toward the cluster of men surrounding David. Lisa's heart slammed violently against her ribs. The Vanguard Syndicate had not relied solely on the subterranean tunnel breach. They had embedded a contingency plan directly into the sanctuary. She did not shout. Shouting would trigger mass panic, creating a chaotic shield for the assassin to utilize. Instead, she moved. She abandoned the protective shadow of the marble pillar, slicing through the dense crowd with terrifying fluid speed. She bumped shoulders, ignoring the startled gasps and polite reprimands of the wealthy guests. Her eyes remained locked entirely on the waiter's right hand, watching the subtle, almost imperceptible slide of his fingers beneath the silver tray. Reaching for a weapon concealed in the polished lining, David turned, sensing the sudden, aggressive shift in the room's atmosphere. He saw Lisa surging toward him, her beautiful features twisted into a mask of pure, lethal focus. He did not brace for an attack from her. He instantly calculated her trajectory and shifted his own weight, opening a path for her momentum. "Down!" Lisa hissed, her voice cutting through the elegant music like a razor blade. She lunged the final 3 feet, colliding violently with the waiter just as a suppressed, matte black firearm cleared the edge of the silver tray. The heavy crystal glasses shattered explosively across the marble floor. Lisa grabbed the assassin's wrist with both hands, twisting fiercely with all her kinetic strength, using her own momentum to drive him hard into the ground. A single, muffled gunshot fired wildly into the vaulted ceiling, sending raining plaster down upon the screaming, scattering guests. David was upon them in a fraction of a second. He did not hesitate. His heavy, polished shoe came down with crushing, bone-snapping force on the assassin's forearm, permanently neutralizing the threat. The guards instantly swarmed the area, their weapons drawn, securing the perimeter in a chaotic frenzy of shouting and movement. Lisa remained on the floor, her breathing ragged, her hands shaking violently as the massive adrenaline spike slowly began to recede. The beautiful velvet of her gown was ruined, covered in spilled champagne and fine dust. David knelt gracefully beside her, seemingly completely unbothered by the chaos erupting around them. He gently, firmly grasped her trembling shoulders, pulling her slightly upward to meet his intense, burning gaze. "Are you injured?" he demanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that commanded absolute truth. "I am mathematically intact," she whispered, her voice wavering slightly as the reality of the violence washed over her. A dangerous, genuine smile finally ghosted across David's lips. "You truly are a magnificent, terrifying anomaly, Lisa." The opulent grand ballroom, moments ago a sanctuary of high society elegance, had been instantly transformed into a chaotic crime scene. Highly trained security personnel moved with swift, brutal efficiency, securing the terrified aristocratic guests and cordoning off the shattered marble where the assassin lay motionless. David did not linger to offer polite, reassuring platitudes to the panicked baronesses or the shaken financiers. His large, warm hand remained firmly pressed against the small of Lisa's back, guiding her rapidly away from the glittering debris and into the hidden, heavily fortified servant corridors that bypassed the public eye. The air grew significantly colder as they descended a narrow, spiraling concrete staircase, leaving the sweeping sonatas and the smell of spilled champagne far above them. The subterranean strategy room was bathed in the harsh, tactical crimson light of a full lockdown protocol. Massive digital monitors spanned the curved walls, displaying real-time thermal imaging of the deep coastal caverns. Lisa stood close to the glowing holographic console, her ruined velvet gown heavy and restrictive with dust. Yet her mind was terrifyingly sharp. "The tide has reached its absolute lowest point," she murmured, her eyes tracing a cluster of vibrant red thermal signatures moving fluidly through the projected three-dimensional tunnels. "The Vanguard operatives have breached the secondary sedimentary barrier. They are progressing exactly as my calculations predicted." David stood beside her, his tailored tuxedo jacket discarded over a chair, his pristine white shirt slightly unbuttoned at the collar. He radiated a dangerous, predatory stillness, his amber eyes fixed intently on the glowing screens. "They move with exceptional discipline," he observed, his voice a low, vibrating hum that barely carried over the whirring of the cooling fans. "They are utilizing acoustic dampeners. Had you not identified the structural discrepancies in the tidal pools, my internal motion sensors would never have detected their approach until they were inside the primary armory. Discipline is merely a predictable pattern." Lisa replied softly, her fingers grazing the edge of the metallic console. "And predictable patterns are fundamentally easy to break." On the central monitor, the Vanguard mercenaries, a highly lethal, heavily armed unit of 30 men, crossed the critical threshold, moving deep into the narrowest, most unstable section of the ancient smuggling tunnels. They were completely silent, completely undetected by the estate's automated defenses, and completely unaware that they were walking directly into a meticulously engineered tomb. David leaned forward, his broad shoulders tensing as he reached out and firmly grasped a heavy, analog brass lever embedded in the control panel. It was a manual override, completely disconnected from the digital grid to prevent external hacking. "Your architectural analysis was flawless, Lisa," he said, turning his head slightly to meet her intense gaze. "You have mathematically engineered their demise. Now, observe the execution." He pulled the heavy brass lever downward with a brutal, uncompromising force. Deep beneath the bedrock of the sprawling estate, an explosive chain reaction was instantly triggered. Lisa felt the profound, rumbling vibration travel up through the thick concrete floor, a deep, earth-shattering groan that vibrated in her chest. On the thermal monitors, the structural support pillars that Lisa had identified as the cavern's weakest stress points simultaneously detonated. The ceiling of the ancient tunnel collapsed with catastrophic violence, instantly sealing the Vanguard unit's only avenue of escape. But David did not stop at simply trapping them. The analog lever also opened the massive, rusted sluice gates of the old hydroelectric reservoir, located directly above the caverns. A terrifying, roaring wall of freezing Pacific seawater violently flooded the subterranean chamber. On the monitors, the organized, disciplined red thermal signatures instantly shattered into chaotic, frantic points of light as the crushing weight of the ocean consumed the narrow space. Within 90 seconds, the violent churning ceased. The thermal signatures faded rapidly, extinguished entirely by the freezing depths. The silent, invisible threat that had sought to assassinate the Alpha King in his own sanctuary was completely, permanently erased. Lisa released a long, shaky breath, her hands gripping the edge of the console until her knuckles turned stark white. She had spent her entire adult life running from men precisely like the ones who had just drowned in the dark. Witnessing their absolute destruction was not a triumph. It was a heavy, suffocating relief that tasted faintly of copper and sea salt. David turned away from the monitors, the crimson tactical lighting casting sharp, dramatic shadows across his striking features. He did not look triumphant. He looked deeply, tragically furious. He pulled up a secondary screen, his fingers typing rapidly across the keyboard. The Vanguard mercenaries did not bypass the internal acoustic sensors through sheer skill, David said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. Someone inside this control room utilized a high-level command code to manually loop the sensor feeds exactly 4 minutes before the breach. The assassin upstairs was merely a distraction to ensure I was not watching the monitors. Lisa's heart accelerated, the cold realization washing over her. The traitor is still inside the walls. The heavy, reinforced steel door of the subterranean strategy room hissed softly, sliding open to reveal Commander Vance. The jagged scar across his left cheek was stark white against his flushed, weathered skin. He stepped into the crimson-lit room, his posture rigid, his eyes immediately darting toward the main monitors. He expected to see the Vanguard unit advancing into the armory. Instead, he saw the entirely flooded, collapsed caverns. Vance froze, the subtle, terrifying realization of his absolute failure washing over his hardened features. He slowly turned his gaze toward the center of the room, where David and Lisa stood perfectly still, waiting for him in the suffocating silence. "The communication lines to the Eastern Patrol have inexplicably failed, sire," Vance stated, his voice incredibly steady, a masterful display of practiced deception. "I came down to manually reset the internal diagnostic grid." David did not move. His hands remained resting casually behind his back, but the raw, oppressive aura radiating from him was heavy enough to crush bone. "The Eastern Patrol is functioning perfectly, Commander," David replied, his tone chillingly polite, entirely devoid of the simmering rage burning in his amber eyes. However, the diagnostic grid did register a fascinating anomaly. It appears a Level 1 clearance code was used to permanently loop the subterranean acoustic sensors. Your clearance code, Vance. The profound silence that followed was broken only by the low hum of the massive servers. Vance did not attempt to stammer out a frantic denial. He was a veteran soldier. He recognized instantly that the fatal calculation had been made, and there was no mathematical possibility of retreat. His sharp, predatory eyes shifted slowly from David to the ruined, dust-covered velvet gown Lisa wore. "This vagrant," Vance spat, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of genuine disgust and desperate fury. "This undocumented ghost from the mud has poisoned your mind. You are the Alpha King. You are the apex of our society. Yet you abandon our sacred traditions, our ancient alliances, to take counsel from a murderous stray who slaughtered your own men. The men she killed were your deeply corrupted accomplices, Vance." David countered smoothly, taking a single, deliberate step forward. "You accepted Vanguard coin to finance a violent, regressive coup. You viewed my progressive alliances as a sign of weakness. You believed burying me beneath the ocean would restore this territory to the brutal, chaotic days of old. I was protecting the structural integrity of our pack," Vance shouted, the thin veneer of his discipline finally shattering. His right hand dropped violently toward the heavy, military-grade firearm holstered at his hip. Lisa had spent years anticipating the subtle, deadly micro-movements of violent men. She did not wait for the weapon to clear the leather holster. She lacked the physical strength to overpower the massive, scarred commander, but she possessed a brilliant, kinetic understanding of her environment. With terrifying speed, she swept her arm across the control console, violently grabbing the heavy, solid brass analog lever David had used to flood the caverns. She did not pull it down. She wrenched it horizontally, ripping the solid metal bar entirely from its rusted housing. Using the heavy brass rod as a makeshift baton, she hurled it with precision accuracy directly at Vance's knee. The heavy metal struck the joint with a sickening, audible crack. Vance bellowed in sudden agony, his leg buckling instantly. His shot went wild, the deafening roar of the firearm echoing violently in the enclosed bunker, the bullet shattering a digital monitor in a shower of brilliant sparks. Before Vance could re-aim, David crossed the distance between them with impossible, terrifying speed. He did not draw a weapon. He struck Vance squarely in the chest with the palm of his hand, a blow carrying such immense kinetic force that the commander was lifted off his feet and hurled backward, crashing brutally into the reinforced steel door. Vance collapsed to the grated floor, gasping frantically for air, his weapon clattering uselessly away into the shadows. David stood over him, smoothing the lapels of his unbuttoned shirt with a chilling, meticulous calm. "You deeply underestimated the value of intellect over brute force, Commander," David murmured, his amber eyes completely devoid of mercy. He turned away, explicitly dismissing the broken man on the floor, and looked directly at Lisa. She was leaning heavily against the console, her chest heaving, the adrenaline finally crashing through her exhausted system. Her beautiful midnight blue gown was thoroughly ruined. Her bare feet were bruised, and the faint scent of gunpowder clung to her hair. Yet, as she met David's intense, searching gaze, she did not look away. She did not cower. "Are you mathematically intact?" David asked, repeating his words from the ballroom, a private, profound connection, solidifying in the dark, smoky air of the bunker. "I am mathematically intact," she whispered, a fierce, genuine smile breaking through her exhaustion. The immediate threat was permanently neutralized. But as the distant sound of the coastal storm raged outside, the heavy, looming reality remained. The 48-hour deadline was rapidly approaching, and the public execution of the vagrant who had slaughtered the royal guard was still explicitly demanded by the society. The morning sun broke through the heavy coastal fog, casting brilliant, fractured beams of golden light across the expansive glass of the solarium. The violent storm had finally passed, leaving the Pacific Ocean remarkably calm, a glittering expanse of deep, sapphire blue. Lisa stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her posture remarkably relaxed for a woman whose execution was officially scheduled for this exact hour. Mrs. Gable had visited her quarters early that morning, maintaining her characteristic silence, but offering a tailored, slate-gray business suit instead of restrictive silk gowns or prison garb. It was clothing designed for movement, for authority, and for absolute control. The heavy oak doors of the solarium opened, and David walked in. He looked rested, powerful, and terrifyingly calm. He carried a leather dossier, tossing it casually onto the polished obsidian table where the scarred Commander Vance had sat just 2 days prior. "The 48-hour deadline has expired," David announced, his low, melodic voice resonating beautifully in the sunlit room. He poured a single cup of dark coffee from the silver service cart and walked toward her. Lisa turned from the window, accepting the warm porcelain cup. "And have you mathematically calculated the method of my dismantling?" she asked, her tone entirely devoid of fear, laced instead with a subtle, challenging warmth. "The public narrative has already been thoroughly established," David replied, standing close enough that the scent of cedar and ozone enveloped her completely. "The undocumented vagrant who murdered the royal guard in the Northern Gorge tragically lost her life last night. She bravely intercepted an assassin's bullet meant for the king during the ballroom gala. Her body was respectfully cremated at dawn." Lisa's eyes widened slightly, her sharp mind instantly analyzing the brilliant, flawless elegance of his political maneuver. He had given the society their required blood, absolved himself of any perceived weakness, and entirely erased her hunted past in a single, masterful stroke. "If the vagrant is dead," Lisa murmured, taking a slow sip of the rich coffee, "then who exactly is standing in your solarium?" David reached out, his long fingers gently, reverently brushing a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. It was a deeply intimate, terrifyingly tender gesture from a man capable of such brutal violence. "You are Lisa," he said softly, his amber eyes burning with intense, undeniable reverence. "A highly specialized, newly appointed chief architectural strategist for the sovereign territory. Your identity papers, your substantial banking credentials, and your absolute security clearances are entirely finalized in that dossier." He stepped back slightly, offering her the space to breathe, the ultimate, terrifying gift of genuine choice. "The heavily armored vehicles are waiting in the courtyard. You possess the resources and the unhindered freedom to disappear into the world, to live exactly as you wish, without ever looking over your shoulder again." Lisa looked at the leather dossier resting on the polished table. It represented everything she had desperately fought for in the muddy, freezing ravines of the wild: safety, anonymity, survival. She could run. She could vanish entirely. She turned her gaze back to David. She saw the immense, heavy burden of his crown, the isolating loneliness of his intellect, and the profound, undeniable respect he held for her brilliant, fractured mind. She had spent her life surviving, falling through the cracks of a cruel world. But here, standing beside the Alpha King, she had finally found someone who did not want to hunt her in the dark. He wanted her to help him build the light. With deliberate, unhurried grace, Lisa walked past the dossier. She moved to the head of the obsidian table, pulling out the heavy leather chair directly to David's right. The position of immense honor, the seat of the trusted architect. The western border requires a complete topographical overhaul, Lisa stated smoothly, sitting down and folding her hands precisely on the table. She looked up at David, a sharp, brilliant challenge in her dark eyes. Your current patrol routes are completely mathematically unsound. We have a significant amount of work to do. A slow, devastatingly genuine smile spread across David's striking features. He walked over to the table, taking his place at the head of the empire, no longer ruling alone in the dark. Then I suggest we begin, Lisa. Lisa's journey from a hunted, desperate ghost in the muddy ravines to the brilliant, indispensable architect of an empire is a powerful testament to the value of intellect over brute force. David recognized that true power isn't found in blind obedience, but in the sharp, mathematical minds that can see the dangerous fractures of the world. They forged an unbreakable partnership built on respect, survival, and a shared quiet brilliance that permanently shifted the balance of their society. Did you enjoy this tense, atmospheric journey? If you found yourself captivated by Lisa's tactical genius and David's calculating, protective nature, please like this story, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more cinematic, slow-burn dramatic fiction.